I hadn't even finished unpacking my last box when the first letter showed up taped to my front door, informing me that the 2-acre spring-fed pond sitting at the back of my property was, according to the Ridgeline Hollow Estates Homeowners Association, community conservation land, and that any personal use of it going forward would need to be, and I remember this phrase exactly, coordinated through the association's Environmental Stewardship Committee. I stood there in my driveway holding that letter, surrounded by moving boxes I hadn't even carried inside yet, and thought to myself that I'd apparently moved into a fight I hadn't even known was waiting for me. My name is Nathaniel Cobb. I'm 58 years old, and I spent 31 years as a firefighter before retiring 2 years ago, the last 11 of those as a captain running a busy station in a mid-sized city I was more than ready to leave behind for something quieter. I bought a 2-acre wooded parcel at the edge of a community called Ridgeline Hollow, up in the foothills, specifically because it backed onto a small spring-fed pond that the previous owner had shown me during the walkthrough with a kind of quiet pride, telling me he'd spent 30 years fishing off that same little dock at the water's edge. I closed on the property on a Tuesday. That letter arrived the following Thursday, before I'd even had the chance to introduce myself to a single neighbor. I want to explain something about the property itself, because it matters a great deal to everything that happened afterward. My 2 acres sit at the northeastern corner of what eventually became the larger Ridgeline Hollow Estates development. But the parcel itself predates that entire subdivision by nearly 2 decades. The previous owner, a retired engineer named Walter Hensley, had purchased that land back in the 1990s, long before any developer had drawn up plans for the houses that now surround it on 3 sides. When the Ridgeline Hollow development finally broke ground about 18 years later, it grew up around Walter's existing property rather than incorporating it, the same way developments sometimes do when they encounter an established landowner who has no interest in selling. The pond itself sits almost entirely on Walter's original parcel, now mine, fed by a natural spring that predates any human development at all. I confirmed all of this myself during the closing process, the same way I confirm everything, methodically and carefully, a habit 31 years of fire investigation work had drilled into me pretty thoroughly. The deed was clean. The survey was clean. Nothing in the title search indicated any shared ownership, easement, or association claim over the water or the land surrounding it. So when that letter showed up claiming the pond as community conservation land, my first reaction wasn't panic. It was the same steady, methodical curiosity I used to bring to a fire scene that didn't quite add up. Something in this situation clearly didn't match the documents I'd just spent weeks reviewing before closing, and I intended to figure out exactly what that mismatch actually was before I did anything else. The letter was signed by a woman named Mariska, president of the Ridgeline Hollow Estates Homeowners Association, and it referenced what it called an established conservation easement dating back to the original development agreement, granting the association stewardship rights over what the letter described as the Heritage Pond Nature Preserve. I called the number listed on the letterhead and got Mariska herself on the second ring. She had the kind of smooth, practiced voice of someone who spends a lot of time explaining rules to people who don't already know them. "Mr. Cobb," she said, once I'd introduced myself, "welcome to Ridgeline Hollow. I do want to clarify the situation with the pond right away, since I understand from our records that you may not be fully aware of the conservation easement in place. The association has stewardship responsibilities over that water feature as part of our original development agreement with the county." "I appreciate the welcome," I said, "but I closed on this property a week ago, and nothing in my title search or survey indicated any conservation easement affecting the pond or the land around it. I'd like to see the recorded document you're referencing." There was a brief pause on her end, the kind of pause that tells you a conversation is about to change direction. "I don't have the exact recording information in front of me at this moment," she said, "but I can assure you it's part of our master development documentation. I'll have our records committee pull the specifics and follow up with you." I thanked her, hung up, and made a note in the small notebook I still keep out of old habit, recording dates and details the same methodical way I once documented fire scenes. Something told me that follow-up call was going to take considerably longer to arrive than Mariska seemed to expect. It took 9 days, not the day or two I'd anticipated, before I heard back from anyone at the association. And when the follow-up finally came, it wasn't Mariska calling with a recorded document number. It was a second letter, considerably more formal than the first, informing me that the association's legal counsel had confirmed the conservation easement's validity, and requesting that I cease any, quote, unauthorized recreational use of the preserve pending a formal review of my property's relationship to the broader development agreement. I'd been out to that dock exactly twice in those 9 days, both times just sitting quietly with a cup of coffee watching the water, and apparently that qualified as unauthorized recreational use significant enough to warrant a second formal letter. I drove down to the county recorder's office that same afternoon, the same way I used to head straight to the source of a fire, rather than relying on second-hand accounts of what had happened. A records clerk named Delphine Osai, a patient woman who'd clearly seen her share of property disputes over the years, pulled the full recorded history for my parcel, along with the original Ridgeline Hollow Estates development agreement filed with the county 18 years earlier. Your parcel's got its own clean deed history going back to 1994, Delphine told me after nearly an hour of searching. I'm not finding any conservation easement filed against it specifically. The development agreement for Ridgeline Hollow does establish a conservation area, but let me check exactly where that boundary sits. She pulled up the recorded plat map for the subdivision and laid it beside the original 1994 survey for my parcel. After comparing the two documents carefully, she looked up at me with an expression I recognized immediately, the look of someone who's just found the exact discrepancy they were searching for. The conservation easement in the development agreement runs along the western boundary of the subdivision, she said, tracing the line with her finger. That's nearly 400 yards from your pond. Whatever they're telling you about a conservation easement over your water feature, it isn't reflected anywhere in the actual recorded county documents. I want to explain how the confusion likely originated, because understanding that piece made the rest of the situation considerably easier to navigate. Delphine dug a little further into the file and found an old, unrecorded planning document from the development's earliest proposal stage, roughly 2 years before Ridgeline Hollow ever broke ground, showing a preliminary concept plan that had, at one point, included Walter Hensley's property as part of a proposed nature trail amenity, an idea the original developer had apparently floated to Walter directly during early community planning discussions. Walter, according to a brief handwritten note attached to that old file, had declined to participate in that concept, preferring to keep his property entirely private, and the final recorded development agreement had been adjusted accordingly, excluding his parcel from the conservation boundary entirely, exactly as Delphine had just shown me on the actual recorded plat. Somewhere along the way, whether through a record's error, institutional memory that simply never got corrected, or Mariska Bell's own genuine but mistaken belief inherited from whoever had held the HOA presidency before her, that old, unrecorded concept plan had apparently continued circulating informally within the association's own internal understanding of the community, treated as though it reflected the actual final agreement, rather than an early proposal that had been specifically abandoned before the development ever received county approval. I called an attorney that same evening, a methodical woman named Corinne Ake, who specialized in property and easement disputes throughout the county, and laid out everything Delphine had shown me. Corinne reviewed the documents I'd photographed at the recorder's office and called me back within 2 days with an assessment that matched exactly what I'd already begun to suspect. "This is about as clean a case as I've seen," Corinne said. "There's no recorded easement over your property. The actual conservation boundary in the recorded development agreement runs well clear of your parcel entirely. Whatever the association believes about that pond, It isn't grounded in anything that would hold up for even a few minutes in front of a judge. I want to be honest that my instinct at that point wasn't to immediately fire back at Mariska Bell with an aggressive legal response. 31 years of fire investigation work teaches you that most fires, and most disputes for that matter, burn a lot more efficiently once you understand exactly where they started and exactly what's actually fueling them, rather than simply dousing the whole scene indiscriminately. So instead of an immediate legal battle, I asked Corrine to help me draft a calm, thorough letter to the association, laying out precisely what Delphine had found at the county recorder's office, including copies of the actual recorded plat map showing the conservation boundary running well clear of my property, and inviting the board to review the documentation directly before this went any further. That letter went out on a Monday. Mariska's response, when it finally came the following week, doubled down rather than reconsidering, insisting that the association's own Environmental Stewardship Committee had conducted its own independent review confirming the pond's status as protected community conservation land, and that my continued use of the water feature would be treated as a formal violation subject to escalating association fines. I found that response genuinely fascinating, in the same way I used to find it fascinating when a fire behaved in a way that didn't match the initial evidence at a scene, because it told me the problem here wasn't simply an outdated internal document circulating by mistake. Somebody, somewhere within that stewardship committee, was actively reinforcing a claim that a 15-minute visit to the county recorder's office would have immediately disproven, and I wanted to understand why. The answer arrived, somewhat unexpectedly, from a woman named Genevieve Prosper, who lived 3 houses down from me and had served on the Ridgeline Hollow Environmental Stewardship Committee for the past 4 years before resigning quietly the previous spring. She stopped by one Saturday afternoon, introducing herself properly and mentioning, almost in passing, that she'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine about my dispute with Mariska over the pond. "I want to tell you something I probably should have said publicly a long time ago," Genevieve told me, sitting on my porch steps while I finished cleaning out the last of the moving boxes still cluttering my garage. "That committee has treated your pond as community property for years, long before you ever bought this place. Mariska's convinced it's part of some grand community heritage trail plan she's been trying to develop, one that would run right along that shoreline and connect to the walking paths on the other side of the subdivision." I asked her whether the committee had ever actually verified the boundary claim against the county's recorded documents. "I raised that exact question twice," Genevieve said. "Both times I was told the legal basis had already been established and confirmed by outside counsel. I never actually saw that confirmation myself, and eventually I got tired of asking a question nobody wanted to answer directly, so I resigned instead of continuing to push it." She mentioned, before she left that afternoon, that Mariska had been quietly working with a landscape architecture firm for nearly a year on preliminary designs for what the association's internal newsletter called the Heritage Pond Nature Trail, complete with a boardwalk, interpretive signage, and a small observation platform, all of it planned for construction directly on and around the water feature sitting on my own private property. That detail changed the entire shape of the situation for me. This wasn't simply an outdated misunderstanding drifting through institutional memory. Somebody had been actively planning, budgeting, and designing a physical construction project on land that belonged to me, based on a claim that had never once been properly verified against the actual recorded county documents. Corrine and I decided at that point that a calm letter citing documentation clearly wasn't going to be enough on its own, given how deeply entrenched Mariska's belief in the project appeared to be. Instead, we requested, through formal channels, copies of every internal association document referencing the Heritage Pond Nature Trail project, along with any legal opinion the association claimed had confirmed their conservation easement over my property. The response took nearly a month, considerably longer than the association's own bylaws allowed for responding to a formal homeowner records request, which Corrine noted with some satisfaction, was itself becoming a documented pattern relevant to the case. When the documents finally arrived, they revealed exactly what Corrine had suspected from the very beginning. There was no legal opinion. There was no confirmed easement. There was, instead, an internal planning memo, nearly identical in substance to the outdated pre-development concept plan Delphine had found at the county recorder's office, treated throughout the association's own internal files, as though it represented settled, established fact rather than an abandoned early proposal. Buried within that same batch of documents was something else considerably more damaging to Mariska's position. An email exchange, roughly 8 months old, between Mariska and the landscape architecture firm she'd hired, in which the firm's own project manager had explicitly asked whether the association held clear legal title or easement rights over the pond property, noting that the firm would need that documentation confirmed before proceeding further with detailed construction plans. Mariska's response, preserved in that same email thread, stated simply that the matter was, quote, being handled internally and shouldn't hold up the design process. Being handled internally. I read that phrase several times, the same way I used to reread witness statements at a fire scene that didn't quite match the physical evidence, because it told me plainly that Mariska had been explicitly warned by her own hired consultant that the legal foundation for this entire project was unconfirmed and had chosen to proceed with planning and design work anyway, rather than pause to verify something that a simple visit to the county recorder's office would have resolved in under an hour. The Ridgeline Hollow Estates Board held its next quarterly meeting about 5 weeks after that document request finally came through, and by that point, word of the dispute had spread widely enough through the neighborhood that the community clubhouse was fuller than I gathered it typically ran for these gatherings. I attended, at Corrine's suggestion, along with Genevieve, who'd offered to speak directly about her own experience raising concerns with the committee that had gone unanswered. Mariska opened the meeting attempting to frame the entire situation as a minor documentation delay in an otherwise legitimate community improvement project. The kind of characterization that might have held up reasonably well if nobody in that room had access to the actual paper trail Corrine and I had spent the previous weeks assembling. Genevieve spoke first, describing plainly and without any particular drama the 2 occasions she'd raised the boundary question directly with the committee and been told the legal basis was already confirmed. Then Corrine presented the recorded county plat map, side by side with the association's own outdated planning document, making the discrepancy between the two impossible for anyone in the room to overlook or dismiss as a simple misunderstanding. The moment that seemed to finally shift the entire room's understanding came when Corrine read aloud, plainly and without embellishment, the email exchange between Mariska and the landscape architecture firm, ending with that same phrase that had stuck with me for weeks. Being handled internally. A board member I hadn't met before, a soft-spoken man named Terrence Whitfield who'd apparently sat quietly through most of the association's recent decisions without much comment, finally spoke up. Mariska, he said, did the firm's own project manager specifically ask you to confirm clear legal title before continuing design work? And did you tell them it was handled when it wasn't? Mariska's answer, when it finally came, was considerably less confident than the letters she'd sent me weeks earlier. I believed at the time that the historical planning documents were sufficient, she said. I didn't feel it was necessary to formally verify something that had been treated as settled community understanding for years. The board voted that same night to formally suspend the Heritage Pond Nature Trail project entirely, pending an independent review of every conservation and easement claim the association had ever asserted throughout the broader Ridgeline Hollow development. A review that, once it finally got underway properly, uncovered 2 additional instances where similar informal assumptions had been treated as settled fact, without ever being verified against actual recorded county documents. Mariska resigned from the board position about 3 weeks later, in a brief note to residents that mentioned, without much elaboration, a desire to step back from association responsibilities. Terrence Whitfield took over as interim president, and one of his first official acts, working alongside Genevieve, who agreed to rejoin the stewardship committee under considerably clearer terms than her previous tenure, was commissioning a full, independent boundary survey of every claimed conservation area throughout the community, resolving the confusion once and for all with proper, recorded documentation, rather than institutional memory passed down informally from one board to the next. As for my pond, it remains exactly what it was the day I first walked that property with Walter Hensley. A quiet stretch of spring-fed water at the back of 2 acres that belong entirely to me, confirmed now beyond any further dispute by an association that finally took the time to check the actual recorded documents, rather than relying on an old proposal nobody had bothered verifying in nearly 2 decades. I still sit out on that dock most mornings with a cup of coffee, the same quiet habit Walter apparently kept for 30 years before me, and I've found, since all of this settled, that a fair number of my neighbors stop by occasionally just to sit for a while and enjoy the water themselves, which I've never once minded, since I never had any objection to sharing a peaceful morning with people willing to simply ask rather than assume. That, I think, is really the whole difference underneath everything that happened. I never once refused anyone access to that pond. I only ever insisted that whoever wanted to build something on my land come to me honestly first, rather than deciding on their own that an old, abandoned proposal from before I ever bought the place somehow settled the matter for good. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether you've ever had a neighbor or an association assume ownership over something that was never actually theirs to claim. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this.